Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special event this evening all about the gut microbiome. My name is Lori Bumbaco. I'm an oncology dietitian. I'm at the center this evening to present this quick hour-long program. Hopefully, after attending this evening, you'll have learned a little something from me. This is one of my favorite topics after oncology nutrition, the gut microbiome. I'm really fascinated by it, so hopefully that will also come across in my presentation. I'm going to share my screen, and so I have a PowerPoint to present to you all. And anyone who has registered, you will receive a copy of these slides. And we're going to make sure we mute everybody in order to move forward. And also, too, there's a great resource that I'm going to share within my presentation. So I found a couple recipes on their website that might be helpful for you all if you're looking to sort of embrace cancer protective foods, but then also to layer on top of that some gut friendly choices. All right, so thank you all again for attending. I'm going to share my screen and present the PowerPoint. So this is all about the gut microbiome. So tonight, what I want to do is review what exactly is the gut microbiome, what's our understanding of it, how the microbiome affects our nutritional status, and then also, too, how what we eat or our nutrition affects our microbiome. It seems like there's a reciprocal relationship here. How, if any, health and disease are implicated in relation to the gut microbiome. I have a handful of frequently asked questions that maybe are on your list. If not, we're going to have a chance to potentially answer some questions that you have at the conclusion of the program. Okay, so an overview of the gut microbiome. This is our friendly little happy gut with a little glimpse of the microbes that are living within it. So the gut microbiota, a little bit more about that. There are microbes that live on and in our body. So there's microbes on our skin, there's microbes in our mouth, there's microbes in our reproductive tract, there's microbes in our lungs, but most of them, the overwhelming majority, live in our gut. If I were to ask you how many, I wonder what you would guess. How many microbes are living in our gut? The estimates at this point are anywhere from 10 to 100 trillion. I cannot even fathom how many that must be, right? 90% of the gut microbes are one of two classes, the bacteroidetes or the firmicutes. So you can use those fancy words when you're sharing this information with your friends. And most of us have close to 500. I've even read in some reports more than 500 different species that reside in the lower gut. 500 different species. Could you imagine? Now, here's what also is, I think, the most fascinating part of the gut microbiome is that we all have a unique one, right? So it's like a fingerprint. There are no single two gut microbiomes that are the same. So imagine how complex that is and how difficult it would be to understand it, right? Because no single two are the same. We're all unique in that way. A little bit more about the distinction between the microbiota and the microbiome. So the microbiota is really just defined as the living microorganisms in whatever environment they're in. So we have an oral microbiota, we have a gut microbiota. The microbiome, however, is the collection of all the genomes, so that's genetic material, right, from all of the microorganisms plus all of their activity. So the environmental conditions that they're creating, the metabolites that they are creating, and then also structural elements that they're involved with. So the microbiome is really what we're looking at in terms of like trying to define its connection with our health or its impact on disease risk. More about the gut microbiome. We develop it during the first 3 years of life. So colonization is initiated during pregnancy and then also shaped by gestational age, the type of birth, the type of feeding, the maternal nutritional status, and the timing of the introduction of solid food. Wow. So all of this in that very short period of time is really making a huge impact on our own gut microbiome today. By the age of 3, we think it's basically fully developed, right? So that's like a long time ago for some of us. So we're set, right? What we develop at age 3 is probably what we're going to carry with us for all of our life. The microbiome is a living organism, so it's dynamic. It's like constantly changing throughout our life. The microbes process information from everything we ingest. I really like that point. I think that's it. That's how we want to look at the microbiome. It's processing what we input, right? So not only does that include food, but also our environment and also other things that we're ingesting and being exposed to in terms of our environment. So antibiotics, stress is an input, and then also illness and other medications can certainly modify the composition of the microbiome. So what microbes are living in there. And when that happens, that impacts the behavior of the microbes. Really, really interesting. This is also fascinating to me. Our digestive tract is a bridge that connects the inside of our body to the outside world. Wow. So one of the major jobs of the microbes is to reinforce the barrier so that substances on the outside that don't belong, don't go inside, right? So that barrier and that structure is very important. The microbiome has other roles. It assists with digestion, absorption of nutrients. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. It produces bioactive substances, including neurotransmitters, enzymes, and these things called short-chain fatty acids. It has a significant effect on our immune response, and it helps to modulate our immune system. And research is evolving. We only have a very limited understanding of the interaction between our body and the microbiome. But you see the image there, that nice lady is holding hands with her microbes because they're like our partners, right? So we coexist with them and we want to really help the beneficial ones that we know of. We want to help them thrive and we want to help them work in our favor to really benefit our health. So how does the gut microbiome and food interact? Let's talk about that. So the microbiome affects our nutrition status. It assists in the body to digest and absorb nutrients from food. Really, really important, right? It helps to harvest inaccessible nutrients or energy from what we eat. So there are a lot of things that exist in our food that are inaccessible to us as human cells, but the microbes actually utilize them. And that's what sort of led to really this significant interest in the microbiome. What is it? What are they doing? They're non-human and they're thriving off of these fuel sources, and they're doing something with that. And it's having this impact systemically on our body. We know that they help to make vitamins. So vitamin K, B12, B6, B5, niacin, biotin, and even folate. And if you know this, infants are born with very low amounts of vitamin K because most of our vitamin K is actually made in the gut, in the colon. So they are often given injections of vitamin K. Did you know that? And that's because their microbiome isn't developed yet. So once after age 3, it's developed, they're probably all set. We're making plenty of vitamin K at that point. The microbiome supports the metabolism of drugs. It assists in the renewal of our gut cells, so those human cells. It acts as a barrier, as I mentioned earlier, to pathogens that we don't want inside of our body. And then also it produces short-chain fatty acids. A little bit more about those short-chain fatty acids in a moment. So how does what we eat affect the gut microbiome? That's an important question, right? Did you know that what we eat, it can influence the microbiome in a very short period of time? We can influence the microbiota with our diet in as little as 24 hours. Wow, that's quite an impact, right? However, really what we're looking at is that long-term diet pattern. So what we eat consistently and habitually, that's what has the greatest influence on the general types of microbes that we have found in our gut. And don't forget, what we formed at the ripe old age of 3 is pretty much what we're guaranteed to have for the rest of our life. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but a plant-based diet has been shown to be associated with the greatest diversity of microbes. And that's a good thing. So having diversity or a wide array of microbes makes our microbiome more capable to do its job and to work in our favor, right? And it also makes the microbiome more resilient. So that's what the experts are now looking deeper at. They think diversity is where it's at, and that's what we want. So how can we support a lifestyle, or how lifestyle can support diversity in terms of the gut microbiome? So what about specific nutrients? And I'm going to review here macronutrients. So those are the larger nutrients that we ingest and we need in significantly large quantities. So if you know your macronutrients, those are carbohydrates, fat, and protein. They have an influence on the microbiota. So those of us who eat a lot of carbohydrates relative to the other two macronutrients, we tend to have more microbes in the Prevotella family. Whereas those who eat a lot of fats or proteins tend to have more Bacteroides in the family. And what does that all mean, right? So Prevotella has been linked in the research with a good thing, with improving blood sugar levels. Now that I find very interesting, right? Because I thought carbs are bad for us, right? They raise blood sugars. Well, not so fast. As it turns out, when we eat a lot of carbs, we might have more Prevotella, but Prevotella helps us manage our blood sugar. So what do you know? Go figure, right? Maybe carbs aren't such a bad thing. Now, there is some research that Prevotella is also linked with increased inflammation. So I think the story is still not all that clear yet, right? We have this mixed information from the research, and I'm actually not surprised by that because that's very typical with research, right? And in something so complicated as the microbiome. So the story, we're going to have to wait and see what the story will unfold there. Now, low carb diets, people that eat low carb diets, they tend to have lower levels of microbes that produce one of the short chain fatty acids, and it's called butyrate. And remember, I mentioned that earlier, the microbes produce short chain fatty acids when they're eating. Part of their byproducts is short chain fatty acids, and one of those short chain fatty acids happen to be butyrate. Now, butyrate is actually a good thing. So when we have higher levels of butyrate in our system, it's been linked with having lower levels of inflammation in our system. And it also helps to support the function of the barrier, right, that lines our gut. So again, this is sort of another argument that maybe low carb isn't the way to go if we're looking to support our gut microbiota, because butyrate is a good thing. If we're eating a low carb diet, we're not having a lot of butyrate in our body. It does make you wonder, right? Now, a lot of you may be wondering, how can we support our gut microbiome? I think in a very easy to answer way, I want to give you two suggestions. So the first is a more diverse diet. So remember, the more diverse your diet, the more diverse array of microbes we can expect to see. The second is to eat foods that support or also strengthen the microbiota. So many of you might be familiar with fermented foods. These contain, that should say contain, not continue, sorry. These contain live and active cultures. So great examples are yogurt and kefir, but also kombucha, and there's several other examples that I'm going to give in a moment. Strengthen the microbiota. Well, prebiotics. And if you haven't heard of prebiotics, let me introduce you to them. So prebiotics are special fibers that are found in particular foods, garlic, onions, bananas, artichoke, and even asparagus. And this is what the microbes use for food. So fibers for humans are indigestible. We do not reap any nutrition when we eat fiber. It just serves a functional purpose. However, microbes use them for fuel. How fascinating is that, right? So not all foods with fiber have prebiotics, but all prebiotics are fibers, okay? So they are just very unique types found in those foods listed on the slide. Now, there was a very interesting study. It was put forth by the American Gut Project, and it was published in 2018, so not too long ago. But what they found is that eating a diverse diet can lead to a diverse microbial community. And so this 30 plant foods every week came to life. And in this research, they took over 10,000 individuals and they were from 45 different countries all over the world. So the American Gut Project is like one of the largest public health science experiments. Really, they recruited people in the public just to kind of sign up for free. And they de-identified their information and kept it confidential. But they were asking them, like, what's your lifestyle? What do you eat every week or every day? And then they actually took stool samples so that they can analyze and then make some connections. What is it about lifestyle that may lead to this microbial output in their stool? What about this? What about these foods? And they started to link and make some connections there. Really interesting information. But what they did summarize is that a wide variety of foods high in fiber helps to maintain a diverse and thriving microbial community. So they summarize this with 30 plant foods every week, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But what are plant foods? Or where do we find these foods high in fiber? It's plants and whole plant foods. So you know what they are. It's vegetables, herbs, nuts and seeds, fruits, legumes, meaning beans and lentils, and then whole grains. You get to decide how much and which ones, how often. But I would say 4 to 5 different plant foods per day is a really great goal to aim for. And maybe you're not there yet, but let's talk about that and work towards that. You can use a different herb when you're cooking. You can snack on a different fruit every day. You can include a different vegetable every day in your meals, right? Switching for some whole grains instead of the refined ones. And then I love like nuts and seeds because, it's a whole big family to choose from. So maybe one day it's pistachios, or one meal it's walnuts, the next it's almonds. You get to decide. But that's where the diversity is at. Now, I don't know about you, but 30 different plant foods sounds like a lot, right? And maybe you feel the same way. So just keep in mind the study outcome. Here's what they did. They found this diversity for people that were eating 30 compared to those that were eating 10 or fewer. So maybe the goal should be to eat more than 10, right? And the goal is to think about how you can improve towards that number of 30, right? A lot of people like to do an inventory. So think about today or maybe tomorrow. What did you eat? How many different plants did you eat? And then just make a simple but realistic goal that you could manageably sustain, right? And then add a little bit more, little by little. And soon enough, you'll be in helping your gut diversity. I am going to share this with those of you who registered. This is a nice little list. And I'm going to print it out myself to see, but it lists just examples. And I think we probably could even add more to this list. But just to see, how close am I getting in a week? And some people are taking it as a challenge, a 7-day challenge, to see if they can get 30 different plant foods in a week. Maybe we should have a competition here, Cancer Wellness Center. I don't know. But it would be really interesting to see, how could you change the diversity of your diet? As I shared, this is like a checklist. So it might be something you could print out and put on the fridge and see for yourself how close you are to getting that diversity you're looking for. So I thought this cartoon was kind of friendly or funny. This is a health shop, and this gentleman's going shopping for some, maybe some probiotics or some additional fermented foods, but he's looking to get some friendly bacteria. And if you see, if he buys over 4 million, he might get another one free. Remember how many different microbes there are in our gut. I mean, it's really fascinating, this dynamic and thriving community. And so we want to look at it, really take a step back and think about the totality of all the things we're doing, right? So I'm going to highlight some specific foods, but do keep in mind, I just listed, 30 different plant foods in a week. That alone is going to support your gut microbiota. But you can think about adding these as part of that mix, right, of those plant foods. So we'll start first with fermented foods. So there's different brands of yogurt, or if you decide to do a non-dairy version, I want you to look at labels because we're going to talk about that in a moment. Different brands use different cultures or different live active bacteria, okay? And then also kefir, fresh sauerkraut, kimchi, or kombucha. And then I mentioned prebiotics. There are the food for the probiotics to eat, the microbes that we have. And so great sources of prebiotics are oats, onion, garlic, leeks, banana, asparagus, and artichoke. There's a ton of plant foods there, right? So these fermented foods, we've been consuming fermented foods for over 14,000 years. Wow. So maybe they've been helpful for our gut all along. Here's different labels for different cultured products. So the one on the top is a yogurt, and you could see there's 5 different live active cultures that are included for that particular yogurt. And then the one here is 3, right? 3 different cultures. So, and they're different. So good to know, right? Because that Delbrecti subspecies, I don't see that in the top one. So this is what we're talking about with diversity. And I learned this, I would say a few years ago, but it really kind of piqued my interest how really like looking at our choices, we have options, right? So maybe it's a different type of a yogurt if you consume yogurt regularly, we tend to be habitual. We tend to do the same things every day. But if you're looking to really, support microbial diversity, try a different brand and see if, maybe that would make a change for you. This last label, there's a lot of live active cultures in that one, right? A lot of different strains. And that is a label for kefir. So no surprise there. They typically use like 9 or more different strains in kefir. So lots of choices again, and you get to decide, and that's what labels can be helpful for. Sometimes I would say, and this is a good presentation for another time, the best way to read a label is to not pay attention to anything else on the package but the ingredients, right? So you just flip right over and you look at the ingredients, and that reveals all. That tells you what's inside the product. And so I would say this is pretty straightforward. This is what you're getting in these options. And then this is kombucha. So if you're not familiar with kombucha, there are lots of products on the market now. It's been pretty trendy now for a while. And kombucha is made with a SCOBY, or a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And you'll see, I don't know if you can tell by this image, but this is like a homemade kombucha. There's like a jelly-like disc that forms at the top as it's fermenting. Now, when you're reading kombucha labels, I want you also to double check what's inside, right? Because you can take a tea and you can make it sweet, right? So maybe you want to get some live active cultures, but you don't want that added sugar. So compare products and see if you can find one that suits you best. And this here is kimchi. If you're not familiar with kimchi, it's really a delicious option. It's a traditional Korean dish, and it's fermented. It's typically used with a cabbage, so Chinese cabbage or Napa. They also use other vegetables in there like radish or carrots, as you see on the image. It can vary in terms of spice or heat flavor, and also its pungency, but there's also often onions and ginger. So really a gut-friendly choice here, right? Lots of ways to have kimchi, but you can just eat it as is too. It's delicious. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about prebiotics. So there's prebiotics that we can eat, and then there's also prebiotics that are added to food. So those are called synthetic forms. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I shared with you in a few slides ago what are the prebiotics that we know of. And I like to really just mention onion and garlic, because if you are cooking at home, any of your meals, you can kind of start them with onion and garlic. It's like a really easy way. It's a no-brainer, right? Because it adds such great flavor as is. But you're adding some fuel for your gut microbes. But you also see their leeks, and then there's also asparagus, oats, banana, all great choices to support the gut. And then there's some synthetic forms of prebiotics. So they are often added to products. And I think this is a trend that's only going to rise, that we're going to see like functional foods for the gut, right? So they're going to take prebiotics they're naturally occurring, but they do isolate it out. So let's say, for example, inulin is an example of a prebiotic. It's not edible. It's the bark of a tree. So it's not really edible for us, right? But in a lab, they can manipulate it in a way that it becomes now digestible for us. But it's a prebiotic still in that it goes down to our colon and it helps as a fuel source for the microbes. And they are just so happy to get it. When they are fed, imagine how they can thrive and they can really support our health in that way. So a lot of the prebiotics are added to foods, functional foods like yogurts or cereals or breads. I've even seen them in some beverages or even cookies, of course. Now, do keep in mind, it might be a great option for you to get some prebiotics if you're not eating the natural forms. But do keep in mind the whole package, right? You're getting prebiotics, but what else are you getting? Are you getting sugars and fats and salts? So just read that whole label to decide. But here's what you can look for on labels to see what the word probiotic is. You won't see, prebiotic. You won't see prebiotic. What you'll see are these other words. So you'll see galacto-oligosaccharides or GOS. You'll see fructo-oligosaccharides or FOS. You'll see oligofructose. You'll see chicory fiber. And as I mentioned earlier, inulin is often used. Okay. So what about the microbiome and its impact on our health? So disturbing the microbiota creates what we call dysbiosis. And if it's disturbed, well, opportunistic pathogens and then the negative activities of those pathogens can increase. So what disturbs the gut microbiota? Some medications can do this. Long-term antibiotic use, aging can do this, infectious diseases, a low fiber and a very highly processed diet can also impact the microbiota. And in theory, chronic stress, although there's not a lot of research to support this because again, it's kind of complicated to study the microbiome and something as subjective as stress. So the link with chronic diseases, there are quite a few in theory at this moment, right? So you see listed here, I like the way they kind of, in the center of this image, they depict how dysbiosis is like this imbalance, right? So it's not like we lose all of the beneficial microbes in dysbiosis, it's just the inappropriate proportion, right? So maybe the opportunistic microbes that are pathogenic, they sort of crowd out the beneficial microbes. Again, we don't really have a practical way of measuring that, and scientists are looking at that to try to understand it better because we're all so unique. What is dysbiosis for you? What's dysbiosis for me? We don't really have a good understanding of that. But they do see this connection, okay? So the strongest evidence I would say right now is for those inflammatory bowel diseases, so such as Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, and then also metabolic disorders, so diabetes as well as obesity. And some of the really fascinating, I think one of the most fascinating stories that ever came out of the gut microbiome was when it was discovered that someone with a C. diff infection, if you know about that infection, it's usually a hospital-acquired infection. It's really a nasty infection to get. It causes really prolific diarrhea, causes dehydration. One of the treatments for C. diff is actually a fecal transplant. And it is what it sounds like. So they'll take stool from a healthy individual and they'll infuse it into the infected individual. And it can help recolonize that infected individual's colon and then help kind of crowd out again those opportunistic microbes. So that happened for an individual. And then within the year, there was this unexplained weight gain leading to obesity for this particular person. So they looked at the donor of the fecal transplant, and that donor happened to have obesity. And so what they learned from that case study is that those microbes that were transfused into the individual seemed to also impact metabolism and weight gain. It was absolutely a fascinating case study. And I think, again, it kind of really opened up a lot of doors for the possibility of how connected our gut microbiota is with our microbiome with our health. So I want to talk more specifically about cancer, right, as an oncology dietitian and the microbiome's impact. So really where there has been a connection, it all kind of started in the 90s, 1994 exactly, when we understood that H. pylori, which is an opportunistic pathogen, it contributed to the risk for gastric cancer. And so we saw like, oh, there's this connection between microorganisms and cancer risk, right? So if you're familiar with our HPV, right, another good example of a opportunistic pathogen that can increase risk cancer types. So if we remember dysbiosis or the imbalance of the gut microbiota, what can happen is it can trigger inflammation and improper immune responses. And so those two are linked with risk for cancer. The greatest connection at this point in time is colorectal cancer. And it seems that high levels of inflammation and a dysregulated immune response can trigger that cascade for events and then lead to the risk for colorectal cancer. Really interesting. But we're looking at the researchers are looking at into how other environments in the body, so the oral microbiota might be linked with oral and digestive cancers. Really interesting. And then how the respiratory microbiota might be linked with lung cancer risk. Wow. So the bottom line on the microbiome and chronic disease links, it is important to point out that our microbiome and its interactions with our body are highly complex, and we're only just beginning to understand tiny fractions of it. However, experts are working to understand how the microbiome can hasten or slow cancer, sorry, that's misspelled, cancer development, as well as influence the response to anti-cancer therapies. So this is like evolving, but it's just now started. So we will soon know, hopefully in our near future, if there is an impact here. And is this going to offer an advantage to those on anti-cancer therapies to somehow manipulate the gut? And is it through lifestyle or through the diet that we could do this in order to kind of give an advantage and in terms of outcomes on treatment? So some frequently asked questions about the gut microbiome. How do you improve or restore the gut microbiome? I get asked that a lot, and I don't have an answer, right? How do we improve or restore the gut microbiome? Perhaps you came across some information from social media or a marketing ad where you see like you can completely restore your gut microbiome, right? Well, that's a little false advertising because we haven't figured out even what the ideal gut microbiome is, right? And remember, it's like a fingerprint. So everyone has a unique microbiota, and therefore we don't know if and how to improve or to restore it, right? So what you're starting out with, we have to understand what that is first, right? And is that working for you or not? And then how to improve that. It's too soon to tell, and we're not there just yet. How can we rebuild our gut microbiome after antibiotics? I think that's a great question. I do want to point out that the experts say that probiotics are not necessarily indicated just because we take an antibiotic. So I want you to talk to your healthcare provider if you're concerned about that for yourself. Do you think you need to take one based on your time on an antibiotic? Probiotics are not shown to rebuild the microbiota. Did you know that? So again, that could be false advertising or marketing that you come across. It's not like you take a probiotic and it builds back your microbiota. That's going to happen in time, and your lifestyle may support that, particularly your diet. And that's the best way to focus on for the time being. Probiotics may be helpful for very specific indications. And again, I don't have the time to review that today. That's not really the topic. But if you're interested, you can talk to your healthcare provider about a specific probiotic because there's different strains for different conditions and you want to be matched appropriately. Okay. Can we test our microbiome? We can actually. So we can send a fecal sample to a lab for analysis. And then we get a list of all the different types of microbes in our gut. It is important to point out that different labs use different technologies. So there's really no consistency, right? There's no governing body that's looking at this and saying, oh yeah, that's the range you should have for this one and that microbe. So be aware that it might be just information for you to have, but nothing that's very practical. Um, we don't know, again, what the ideal gut microbiome is. We're all so, so unique. And so it's hard to really predict what is the best microbiome for you. What's the latest research? So I think this is really interesting. There's a connection between our gut and our brain, right? So you may have heard of this. Our diet and our mental health may be linked partially through the microbiota. So our microbes, they talk to our brain in several ways, and they may be actually influencing some risk for mental health disorders, and that may be related to what we're eating, or it may have partly to do with the relationship between the two. Some microbes may, we know this already. Some gut microbes synthesize neurotransmitters, including serotonin, including dopamine. And so how much of those are happening from what foods, we haven't really connected all of that yet. But that definitely is being highly researched at this point in time. And I think there's a big interest in improving mental well-being. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of eyes on this right now. So time will tell, and hopefully relatively soon, how we might be able to improve our mental health disorders, specifically depression, but some neurocognitive concerns like Alzheimer's. They all may be linked with our gut microbiome, and how we might be able to influence that through diet and lifestyle is still a matter of time. So here's some healthy gut tips, how to keep our gut happy. So again, it's those plant foods. Does it sound familiar? Does it sound like the oncology dietitian may have suggested plant foods before? So you can support yourself in more ways than one here by consuming a plant-based diet. Adding a new fruit or vegetable each week. I always like to point out that frozen choices count, especially this time of year where we have limited access because of the climate. So, don't be afraid to look in that frozen section in the store, because you may be really pleasantly surprised. I would say frozen fruit especially is a great option. It's such a fantastic option. It tastes delicious as well. So keep that in mind for yourself. I love the idea of using mixed greens, right? Because you're going to get, like, in a bag of mixed greens, you might get 5 different types of lettuce rather than just one, like spinach or iceberg or romaine. Not to say that those aren't good choices, but if you're looking for that diversity, that's an easy switch that you can make. Try different herbs. Can you add them to add new flavors to your meals? Using different beans or lentils in salad, soups, or stews. And this really, it supports that argument that canned beans are a great thing to have in your pantry, because it adds the diversity, right? You can have different canned beans, different varieties, and it's super convenient, right? All you want to do is drain and rinse them really well, and voila, you have a new plant food that you can add to your food. I love the idea of that frozen fruit into something like yogurts or smoothies or oats in the morning. Going meatless once or twice a week or more if you even dare to. So things like tofu or tempeh, beans and lentils, it's a great substitute for meat, and it could help to support, again, that gut microbiota in more ways than one. You're eating some fibers in there, right? So for prebiotics, but you're also getting cancer protective properties to those plant foods as well. Adding a sprinkle of seeds to hot cereal in your smoothies or yogurt. So, there's a range, right? We can use hemp seeds, we can use chia seeds, flax seeds are great for the gut. And then even something like high protein pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds for vitamin E. I mean, the options are endless if you think about it. And another easy thing to kind of keep on hand, because they can just very easily be added. They're versatile that way, right? You can add it to a lot of your choices. These are 3 recipes that I included that I found on one of the websites that I'm going to share next, that I thought they looked really tasty at the moment that I saw them. So one is like a homemade muesli in the top left corner there. And you could see, just looking at that visually, you could see how lovely and bright and vivid that is, with different plant foods. That alone probably has, like, what, like 6 or 7 different plant foods. But then the oats are going to add that prebiotic fiber that we're looking for as well. And then these are apricot bliss bites. So if you are familiar with like energy bites or energy balls, they're a really easy way to kind of add in some intentional ingredients, right? So if you wanted to add something like flax seeds to these, you're going to add in again that functional fiber that's going to help to support the gut. And maybe it's just a new way for you to include some flax seeds that you weren't aware of before. And then on the top right corner, that's like a sheet pan bake, which I think are really great ways to, again, add diversity to the diet, right? Because you could put on different vegetables onto your sheet pan. You can use whatever you have on hand. This particular recipe calls for chicken, but you can substitute a plant-based protein for that, something like tempeh or tofu very easily. And then this particular sheet pan uses miso as a marinade. So a fermented choice. This is really great stuff for the gut here on this slide. So miso, if you're not familiar, it's a fermented soybean paste. And it's ancient. I think it's been, used in Japan for centuries upon centuries. And it's sort of started the way a sourdough starter would be made. So they use a fermented grain like rice or barley, and then they take soybeans and they kind of mush it all together. And then they create miso from that. There's lots of different types of miso. There's a white miso that's a little more mild, down to like a brown and red miso that has a more intense, bold flavor. I like to keep it on hand just to add to like a marinade or to use as like a dressing for like a grain salad or a green salad. It adds such great umami. So talk about really a little bit going a long way. And then you're getting some fermented, a fermented choice by having that. So here are some resources that I wanted to share as well. This is the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics. One of my favorite resources. I discovered them a while ago, but they have a great section. I go to this section, actually, the consumer section. There's a science section, but I go to the consumer one because it's really such user-friendly information. It explains all of the terminology. So if you're looking to understand more about fermented foods, what is fermented, what doesn't count as fermented, like sourdough bread, for example, isn't technically fermented. And then it has a ton of updated information as we go along. So every time I go back and look, it's been updated. I really appreciate that. And then the other one I came across that you might find interesting is the role of diet and nutrition in a healthy gut microbiota. And this is from the Canadian Digestive Foundation. Sorry about that. And it has like these YouTube clips that are literally like a minute or two that explains all about food and the microbiome and how there is maybe this way that we can help ourselves to really benefit our outcomes through diet. And a lot of that I touched on tonight, but there's some supporting information there as well. And that is my PowerPoint for this evening. I am going to stop my share. It looks like we have some inputs in the chat that Lisa could perhaps read off.
We do. We have several. Let me start at the top. You may have answered this question halfway, but I'm going to read it anyway.
Okay.
Can you speak to fermented foods like kombucha and alcohols, these particular alcohols and cancer risk?
Oh, great question.
Yeah, and then it says, I was told 0 alcohol at survivorship consult.
That is a really great question. So something like, technically the fermented foods, like something like kombucha, yes, technically it has alcohol. It will probably be listed on the label. I gotta say, here's what I gotta say. It is a pretty insignificant amount. However, it's your comfort level. If you do not care to have alcohol at all in your system, then I would not go for the kombucha. Because here's the thing. You can have so many other fermented foods to choose from, right? So yogurts or kefir, non-dairy choices in those two families, right? And you're going to get some live active cultures. So you don't have to force yourself to have something like kombucha, which may have a minuscule amount of alcohol in it.
Thank you. All right, next question. If your biome is like a fingerprint and it's established by the age of 3, how does a diverse diet impact the microbiome? Which I
Really good.
thought was a great question because she was reading my mind.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I didn't explain this in my presentation. I probably should have. So our life along the way, like aging, that's something that we can't help. But getting an infection, having to take antibiotics, getting an infectious disease, right? Like something like an infectious diarrhea, traveler's diarrhea, that impacts the microbiome, right? Because the microbes are going to be thrown off balance. So what we want to do, so what the researchers have found is we can kind of get back on track if we um, choose those foods and choose those things that I highlighted that can help kind of reestablish what we were having before. Okay. I hope that explains a little bit better. But here's what they don't really know. Everyone responds differently. So let's say you take antibiotics, like a really strong, heavy duty one for a long period of time. Two people can respond differently in terms of their microbiota. So some people bounce back to their old one. Some people, it takes them a little bit longer before that happens, right? But I think you could with diversity in the diet, you could help yourself bounce back quicker. And with diversity in the diet, you can help yourself have a little bit more. It's not going to crowd out. You're always going to have this balance, right? And it kind of goes back and forth, up and down. You could really help support that beneficial balance by having that diverse diet. It's not going to change what you have, right? Hopefully I'm explaining this better, but you can increase the amounts of what you have that are beneficial. Okay.
Makes sense.
Okay. It's hard to explain.
Next question. I'm sure all yogurts aren't created equal. What are some good brands and varieties, and what are not so good varieties?
That's putting me on the spot. I would say just read labels. I'm a big fan of going with unflavored, plain, because you could add the flavor to it. You could go yogurt, especially Greek yogurt. It's like sour, right? So you could use it as a substitute for sour cream in recipes. That's a great idea, right? And you could go savory with it, right? Like, so you can chop up some herbs or put some spices in it and dip some veggies into that. Boom, or you can go sweet. And if you prefer sweet and you want to add a little bit of your own sweetener, like a little honey or a little date syrup or chopped up dates, really kind of play around with that. But I heard this at a lecture. I shared this during the presentation. It was a few years ago where the lecturer said, if the yogurt's on sale, get it, because that forces you to change different yogurt types and you'll get the diversity there, which I thought was really, really interesting, right? But scan the label. We don't want a lot of added sugar in our yogurt. That's the biggest, I think, tip.
Thank you. Next question. I've seen that MD Anderson is doing studies on how fecal transplants and other microbiome enhancements can help cancer patients as part of their treatment.
Wow.
Do you or the Cancer Wellness Center, are you familiar with any of these local studies?
I am not. I know that research is looking at immunotherapy because, again, if that's the way the treatment's looking to support how the immune system recognizes a cancer. And so is there a way that we can also support that through diet to help the immunotherapy work better? And that's my understanding. That's the strongest research right now. And they've looked at it in a couple different cancer types. Really interesting. They're not looking at probiotics. They're looking at, like you said, fecal transplants, or is there something in the diet, a high fiber diet might be recommended for individuals on immunotherapy. It's a little too soon to tell. So I encourage you to talk to your healthcare team.
Okay. I read that not all pickles and sauerkraut are prebiotic, or is it probiotic? That it needs to be fermented. How do we know?
Good question. Yeah. So if it's like on the shelf, it probably, and it's warm, it's at room temperature and it's warm. If it's pasteurized, it's probably not a probiotic. right? It's probably not, because anytime you heat something, it's going to kill the microbes that are in it. And pasteurization definitely does it, right? So they often do that with pickles and sauerkraut. There are fresh versions out there. Some people do it at home because there's cultures on the outside of vegetables that you could put into a salt brine and then burp off as it ferments. And then that's where the probiotics are, because there's live active cultures on the outside of the vegetables. But if it's on a large scale manufactured product, they're probably pasteurizing it, right? So it's very, very high heat, and therefore bye bye bugs, right? Those
Lori,
microbes.
didn't you say that if it has vinegar in it, that it's not? Yeah, that's what I look for to see if it has vinegar in it, and I don't buy the ones that have vinegar.
Um, I think vinegar probably would destroy it as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's such an acid environment. So that's what's also fascinating about probiotics. They're really tightly defined. Same with prebiotics. They have to they have to prove themselves, so to speak. So I think conditions matter, right? And if they're not in the condition that they need in terms of the environment, they're not going to serve their purpose. Okay, good
Okay.
question.
I've heard that oats that aren't cooked are a better prebiotic. Is that correct?
Um, that's a good question. I think if I'm gonna say in theory, probably. I actually don't know the answer to that question, but in theory, probably, because it's gonna retain just a touch more fiber, and so those microbes are really happy to get it, and they are just munching away at the fibers that we don't digest. And so when you're not cooking something, it might not be significant. That's the only thing, but it doesn't hurt to have some, overnight oats or to cook your oats once in a while. I think that's where the diversity might even benefit.
Okay. Generally, how does chemo affect our gut?
Um, how does what affect the gut?
Chemo,
Oh,
chemotherapy.
chemo. Oh, good question.
Hmm.
I I wish I knew. I think it does. Because there's turnover of cells, right? So I think it probably weakens the barrier, the lining, and it probably influences their ability to perform their functions the way they normally like to, because it's the whole environment is disrupted, right? And the supportive medications you take. So I think it's a little bit of it's more than one thing that's happening. I don't think they really understand the the extent of it, or let's say you have digestive changes because of chemo, whether it be diarrhea or constipation. I think that's all influencing what's happening in the gut in terms of the microbiota and how they're acting and how behaving, right? So I'm waiting to see, are they going to look at that further, and does that even matter, right, for outcomes? Time will tell.
Okay. Back to the yogurt. What's
Yes.
the best yogurt or kefir to eat if you're lactose intolerant?
So that's a good question. I would say many people with a lactose intolerance tolerate fermented products okay, because the live active cultures actually work to pre-digest the lactose that's in it. So it depends on the extent of the lactose intolerance. If you're very lactose intolerant, like you can't even handle a drop of it, then I would say you probably either need to take lactase enzymes so that the enzymes can help you digest the lactose. Or you could try, if you notice you're just a smidge lactose intolerant, like you can't have a glass of milk, then you probably are okay with yogurt. Many people with lactose intolerance handle fermented dairy just fine.
That's fascinating.
No.
Okay. Using fermented foods in cooking can kill the good bacteria. Are there some that hold up better? I'm not a big fan, so would prefer to incorporate into another dish. Also, I've heard that some canned foods like kimchi can lose the cultures due to heat in the canning process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're not sure. And there's no, like, again, there's no governing body that's saying like, oh yeah, we certify that this still has them, the probiotics in it, right? Those bugs are still in there and existing and thriving. We don't really know. And so it's just kind of a guess. To answer the first part of that question, I think that's a great question. I don't really have an answer though, because I think like, I don't think that there's any that hold up better than others, you know? So, but keep in mind that when we eat live active cultures, it's not like changing our gut. What we have is what we have. And what we could do is help increase the good stuff by eating the diversity and giving it prebiotics, the onion, the garlic, the bananas, the asparagus. Eating those foods will help what the good stuff we have work even better. So I think that if you're going to focus on like working on the gut health, I would say those are the two things to focus on. And it's okay. So if you eat fermented foods here and there, great.
Okay, we have a couple more, which will probably
Yes.
bring us right to the end.
Yes.
Okay, how about hemp seeds, for example? Should we eat them raw or cooked in order to get the benefit?
Nah, I would, you don't have to eat them raw or cooked. They're both ways are great. I like them raw. If you cook them, you know, there's oil in there, so it is sensitive to breakdown, right? If we overheat it. So I would try them raw if you can find them, and use them that way. I think that's what's so great about hemp seeds are they can be added raw to a lot of different things.
Okay. Can you speak to cashew yogurt and probiotics?
Yeah, so I was dairy free in my first year postpartum, and I got a taste of a lot of non-dairy products. There's not a lot that are really palatable in my opinion. I had to do a lot of homework. I found that cashew yogurt was my favorite. I read the labels. I made sure that they had live active cultures in them. So there's different brands. There's a handful of brands, I would say. My particular favorite was Trader Joe's. I found that one because it was plain as well. I found that one to be my favorite out of all of them. So if that's one you want to give a shot and try, I endorse that one as well on a personal note.
Trader Joe's, Lori, endorse?
Yeah, right. What else is new?
So the 2 bags of miso behind you, someone commented. Can you share some info on those 2 bags?
That was a little setup, right? We have
Uh-huh.
these, yeah, we have these in the kitchen. You might find miso at the at most grocery stores, but I'll share these we picked up at Whole Foods. This is a shiro miso, so that's the white one. You can't really tell in the package. But it's rice, it's that fermented koji, the rice and soy. And it's mild. I think if you're going to start with a miso, I would get this one because it's the most mild. And like miso soup that you ever had, if you did takeout or ate at a restaurant with miso soup, they're using this miso. And so if you enjoy that umami, that pungency, which is really actually quite delicious, you'll like this, right? And you can use it as a marinade. You can make like a dressing with it. I think that's the most straightforward, simple application. Okay. And then this one is a red miso, hacho miso. So this is made with barley, roasted barley. And then they have right on there the koji, the name of the koji. This one is aspergillus orze. And so this one is fermented like a little bit longer. I don't know if that means that there's more of the culture in it. I don't know. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. I've never looked that up. But it's fermented longer, so there's a deeper flavor. It's very, very pungent, very strong. So I would say like this, start with the white one. And then, you know, if you enjoy this, then try another type.
Well, thank you, Lori. That brings us to 7 o'clock with all of our questions. So we appreciate everybody joining. As Lori mentioned, I am going to send out the slide presentation with those recipes as well as a recording to this YouTube link. So, and with that email, I will also include a program evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback, and this is another opportunity for you guys to share with us what other program content you'd like us to share. So if there's anything to do with anything, this is a great way for you to share that with us on these evaluations. So I'll be sending that out as soon as I get Lori's slides.
Very soon.
So I'm going to go